The Man We Married. A thriller. Narrated by Jessica Anne Bogart. Written by Barron Darby. Chapter 1. The message came from a woman I had never met, and it was 4 words long, and it took my whole life apart in the time it took to read it. I was in the school pickup line when my phone lit up on the passenger seat, a number I did not know, a little gray bubble, and I glanced at it the way you glance at anything while 300 minivans inch toward a curb. Then I read it again, at the full stop, with my foot on the brake and my daughter waving at me from the sidewalk, and the whole ordinary afternoon went very quiet and very far away. Is your husband home tonight? I almost deleted it. Wrong number, I thought. Some crossed wire, some woman texting the wrong Claire about the wrong man, and I had the little trash icon under my thumb when the second message came, and the second one had a photograph attached, and the photograph was of my husband, David, asleep, in a bed, in a bedroom I had never seen in my life. Cream walls where ours are gray, a window on the wrong side of the headboard, a woman's silver watch on the nightstand that was not my watch, next to a paperback that was not David's book, in a room that was not my room, with my husband of 11 years sleeping in it exactly the way he sleeps in ours, on his back, one arm flung up over his head, his mouth fallen slightly open in the particular way it falls when he is deeply and truly gone, a thing I had believed until 3:14 on a Tuesday afternoon, that only I in all the world had ever seen. Chloe opened the car door and climbed in, smelling like chlorine and grape juice, and started telling me about a girl named Priya who could do a flip turn, and I said the right things. I heard myself say them from very far away, that's wonderful, buckle up seatbelt, and I pulled out of the pickup line with a photograph of my husband asleep in a stranger's bed, burning a hole through the phone on the passenger seat, and a second text glowing underneath it that I could not stop reading at every red light on the way home. Is your husband home tonight? Because he told me he'd be at mine. I did not text back at the light. I did not text back in the driveway. There is a version of a woman who screams in her car, and I have wondered since why I was not her, and I think the answer is that some cold, clean part of me, a part I did not yet know the size of, understood in the first 90 seconds that whatever this was, it was not an accident, and that a woman who screams learns nothing. So I made Chloe her after-school toast with the cinnamon sugar the way she likes it, and I started the water for pasta, because it was Tuesday, and Tuesday is pasta, and I stood at my own kitchen counter in my own gray kitchen, and I looked at that cream-walled room until the edges of it were burned into the back of my eyes. The watch, the paperback, spine cracked, a thriller, dog-eared at page 200. The wrong side window with a maple outside it that does not grow in my yard. And my husband, my David, sleeping the sleep of a man with nothing at all on his conscience, in a bed I had never made. At 6:40 he texted me, the way he texted me every night he was away. Landed fine. Client dinner ran long going to crash. Miss you and the bean. And a little blue heart, the same blue heart he had sent me for 11 years, and I stood in my kitchen and watched it arrive, and understood that somewhere 90 minutes away, a woman had watched him type it, or would watch him lie about having typed it, and I typed back, "Miss you too, sleep good," because I am, whatever else I turned out to be, a person who does not tip her hand before she has seen the whole table. I put Chloe to bed. I read her the chapter. I did the voices. I turned off the lamp. And then I sat on the edge of my own bed in the gray room with my reading glasses on the nightstand where they always are, and I picked up my phone with a hand that had gone strange and cold and steady, and I typed the only thing there was to type to a stranger who had my husband asleep on her camera roll. "Who is this?" The 3 dots came up almost at once. She had been waiting, I understood later, as frightened and as awake as I was, 90 minutes away, in the cream-walled room, holding her own phone in her own 2 hands. And when her answer came, it did not answer my question so much as detonate the ground the question stood on. "You don't know me," she wrote, "but we're married to the same man, and I don't think either of us is the only thing he's lying about." Chapter 2. Her name was Renata, and she thought my husband's name was Michael, and that was the first crack in the world. The moment 2 women who had never met, who had no reason on earth to know the other was alive, discovered that they had been married to the same man for the same 11 years, under 2 different names, in 2 different cities, 90 minutes apart, on the same gray interstate. We got on the phone that night near midnight, both of us in our separate dark houses, with our separate sleeping children, and we did the terrible forensic thing that 2 women do when the floor drops out. We laid our lives down side by side on the table and we went looking for the seams. And there were no seams, which was the horror of it. There was only fit. His travel. My conferences, 3 or 4 a year, always regional, always vague. Her the road again, baby. Contracts up in the northern accounts. His 2 phones, the everyday one and the gray one, the work one, the one I was told 100 times never to answer because of client confidentiality, because of compliance. A word he said so smoothly, I had never once heard the lie inside it. She had the same rule, never answer the gray phone. And then, worse than the schedule, the small things. The details that no engineer of a double life should ever have let repeat, and that he let repeat anyway, because they were not carelessness. I understand now. They were the man himself, the true grain of him showing through both painted surfaces. He proposed to me on a Ferris wheel. He proposed to Renata on a Ferris wheel. He told me his mother was dead, and he could not talk about her. He told Renata his mother was dead, and he could not talk about her. And when we compared the 2 dead mothers, they had died the same invented way, a long illness, bravely born, in a town neither of us could find on a map. He gave me a nickname, Bean, for the way I curled up to sleep. He called Renata's son, our son, the same word. There was one book, always one book, a dog-eared thriller, that he left on the nightstand of the woman he was studying, the same title in both houses, and Renata laughed when I said it, a terrible cracked laugh with no bottom in it, because she had teased Michael for years about that book, the one book he claimed to be forever rereading and never seemed to finish, and I had teased David about the exact same one. It was the same performance, run twice, with the props swapped, and half the props not even swapped, and sitting in the dark hearing my own marriage read back to me in another woman's voice was like watching a stranger perform an impression of my whole life and get every note right. The anniversaries he made and the birthdays he mysteriously missed. And when Renata read me her calendar of his absences, it was a photographic negative of my calendar of his presences, the 2 of them fitting together tooth and groove across more than a decade. Every weekend I had him, she did not. Every holiday she had him, I was told he was closing a deal in another time zone. It was not the schedule of a man who was cheating. Cheating is sloppy. Cheating is a man improvising in the cracks of his life. This was engineered. This was a man who got up every single day and went to work at the job of being 2 husbands, and was better at it, more diligent, more disciplined than most men are at being one. He has a son with me, Renata said, and her voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of a person walking a ledge in the wind. Matteo. He's 9. He has David's, Michael's. He has that same cowlick, the one that won't lie down. I looked across my dark bedroom at nothing. I have a daughter, I said. Chloe. She's 9, too. She has the cowlick. And there was a silence on the line then, a specific and terrible silence, the silence of 2 women arriving from opposite directions at the same unbearable arithmetic, that our children were half-siblings, born the same year to the same father in 2 houses he had kept from each other for a decade, the way a man keeps his left hand from knowing what his right hand is doing, and that these 2 9-year-olds had a whole secret brother, a whole secret sister, 90 minutes down a highway, and had been kept from each other on purpose, as a matter of operational security, by a man who tucked them both in on alternating nights and called them both his whole world. I could have stayed in that grief. It was a large enough grief to live in for the rest of my life. But I am a person who notices the shape of things, and there was a shape to this night that the betrayal was hiding, and I made myself look at it. Renata, I said, the photograph. Who took it? The line went quiet again, but it was a different quiet, not the shared vertigo of the last hour, a guarded quiet, a quiet that was deciding something. What do you mean? She said. Someone stood in that bedroom, I said, close enough to fill the frame, while he was asleep, and took a picture of his face and sent it to me, a stranger, tonight, on purpose. I heard my own voice getting cold and clear, the voice I did not yet fully recognize as mine. A man doesn't run 2 marriages for 11 years without one single seam, and then get caught by accident on a Tuesday. Somebody made tonight happen. Somebody wanted the 2 of us on this phone right now, so I need you to tell me, Renata, did you take that picture of him in your bed and send it to me? Because if you did, I understand why, and I am not angry, but I need to know who I'm actually talking to. The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up, and when she came back, her voice had changed a 3rd time, gone quiet and even and frightened in a new key, and what she said turned the whole night from a story about a cheating husband into a story with a pulse and a patience and a plan. I didn't take it, Renata said. I didn't send you anything, Claire. I found your number the same way you found out about me, because 2 hours ago, a number I don't know sent me a photograph too, of him asleep, but not in my bed. She took a breath I could hear. In yours, the gray room, your reading glasses on the nightstand, and underneath it, it said, ask her who she really is. Chapter 3. We agreed to meet because we were past the point where a phone could hold what we were carrying, and because each of us needed to look at the other and decide, in person, whether she was a fellow victim or something else. That sentence, ask her who she really is, had put a small cold stone in the middle of the table between us, and neither of us said another word about it that night. But it sat there, and we both knew it sat there. We met the next morning at a diner exactly halfway between our 2 lives, a chrome and vinyl place off the interstate that neither of us had ever been to, chosen precisely because neither of us had ever been to it. I got there first. I took the booth in the back with my spine to the wall and my eyes on the door, and I watched her come in, and I knew her before she'd cleared the entrance, not from any photograph, but because she came through that door the exact way I had come through it 10 minutes earlier, scanning, cataloging exits, a woman who had learned in a single night that the world has a false bottom and was not going to be caught standing on it again. She slid into the booth across from me. Up close she was younger than her voice, dark-eyed, tired in the specific way of a woman who had not slept and had a 9-year-old to get to school anyway. We ordered coffee we did not drink, and then, without a word, we did the thing we had come to do. We put our phones on the formica between us side by side, turned to face each other, the two photographs, his sleeping face in her cream room, his sleeping face in my gray room. 2 rooms, 1 man, the same fallen open mouth, the same flung-up arm photographed by someone standing close enough to touch him, in 2 houses 90 minutes apart, on what may or may not have been the same night. And I looked at the 2 of them lying there next to each other, and I felt the marriage I had lived inside for 11 years finish coming apart, quietly, the last threads of it, right there over a plate of cold toast. "Okay," Renata said. She had brought a folder, an actual paper folder, and I understood then that she was not only a victim, she was a person who knew how to work, because she had spent the same sleepless hours I had spent staring at a ceiling, actually digging. I couldn't sleep, so I stopped trying and I started looking. "Claire, he's done this before. Before you. Before me." She opened the folder, and she laid it out for me the way you lay out something you are afraid of, 1 page at a time. There had been a wife in Ohio, years ago, before either of us, a woman named Diane. Diane had married a charming man who traveled for work, a man whose name, in Ohio, had been neither David nor Michael, but something else again, a 3rd name, a first draft of the man we married. And Diane had had money. Not a fortune, but the kind of solid, quiet money that does not need a man. An inheritance, a paid-off house, a life insurance policy of the ordinary, responsible kind that married people buy each other and forget about. And Diane had drowned, alone, in her own bathtub, 4 years into the marriage. An accident, a tragedy, a slip, and a bump on the head, ruled exactly that by an overworked coroner in a small, quiet county who had no reason on earth to look harder, leaving everything, the inheritance and the house and the ordinary forgotten policy, to a grieving husband who sold the paid-off house before the flowers on the grave had wilted and vanished into the middle distance of the country and surfaced eventually, 90 minutes apart, as 2 men named David and Michael, married to 2 women named Claire and Renata, who each had, if you knew to look, money, an inheritance, a paid-off house. "He's not cheating on us," Renata said very quietly, laying down the last page, a photocopy of a death certificate with a stranger's name on it. That's what I couldn't understand at first. The cheating doesn't make sense. It's too much work, 2 whole families. It's insane. Nobody does that for the sex. But he's not doing it for the sex. The other marriage isn't the crime, Claire. The other marriage is the alibi. A man who is provably home in 1 city can't have done a thing in another. We're not each other's other woman. She looked up at me, and her dark eyes were steady and terrified at once. We're each other's cover story, and we're both Diane. He's just been living with us, both of us, all these years, deciding which one of us goes in the bathtub first, and using the other one's house as the place he was that night. I looked at this brave, exhausted, honest woman across a table of cold coffee and 2 photographs and 1 photocopied death certificate, and I felt the fear arrive, real and total and correct, the animal fear of a creature that has just understood it is not a wife, but a plan. And I let her see that fear on my face, all of it, because it was real, and because she needed to not be alone in it. What I did not let her see was the thing underneath the fear, the thing that had been living under everything I did and said for 3 years, so far down it had almost stopped having a name, because I already knew about Diane. I had known about Diane for 3 years. I knew the name of the small county and the name of the tired coroner. I knew the page number Diane's paperback had been dog-eared to when they found her, because it was the same book that was on the nightstand in the cream-walled room, because he gives it to all of us. It is part of how he studies us. And I knew that Diane had swum a half-mile in open water every morning of the 20 years I had known her, and that a woman who swims a half-mile every morning does not drown, face down and peaceful, in 18 inches of her own bathwater. Renata had spent one sleepless night and done real, impressive, honest work, and had found her way to Diane. And Diane was not, could not possibly be, a name that Renata was ever supposed to reach. Because I was the one who had buried Diane, and I was the one who had spent 3 years making very sure that no one else ever went looking. Chapter 4. We had a week. I did not know it was only a week then. I thought we had as long as it took. But I want to tell you about those days because they were the days I did the most careful and the most dishonest work of my life. And they were also, God help me, the days I was happiest in 3 years, and I have never been able to make those two facts stop being true at the same time. Renata wanted to find the photographer. Of course she did. It was the loose thread her honest mind could not stop pulling. Someone had stood in both our bedrooms. Someone had put us together. Someone out there in the dark was on our side, or was another kind of danger entirely. And until we knew which, she could not sleep. And so I spent that week doing the strangest performance of my life, which was helping a good woman hunt for a criminal I already knew intimately, because the criminal was me. I want you to sit with how that felt, because it is the truest picture of what I had made myself into. Every morning, Renata would text me a new theory, and every morning I would take her theory in my 2 hands and, gently, expertly, turn it toward a wall. She thought it might be a private investigator some earlier victim had hired. A reasonable, dead-end idea, and I fed it. I spent 2 days helping her chase a fictional investigator down fictional roads, printing out real records that led to real nowhere, being a wonderful partner in an investigation whose only actual function was to keep her looking anywhere but at me. And then, on the 3rd day, Renata found Paula, and I very nearly lost control of the whole thing, because for the first time that week the trail she was pulling on was a real trail that led to a real secret. Just not the secret she thought. Paula was David's assistant, Michael's assistant. She knew him as Michael, worked out of a rented half-floor of an office he kept in Renata's city. A brittle, competent woman in her 50s who booked his travel and screened his calls and had, Renata was certain, booked the fake travel, papered over the impossible calendar, been the human being who made one man's double life run on time. Somebody has to know, Renata said, and her eyes were bright with it, the first real lead her honest mind had caught the scent of. Somebody types the itineraries, Claire. Somebody books 2 hotels for the same night. It's her. It has to be her. And I looked at her hope, and I felt the ground tilt, because Paula was a genuinely dangerous thread. Not because she was the photographer. I knew who the photographer was. I met her eyes in the bathroom mirror every single morning. But because a woman who books a bigamous travel is a woman who might, if a grieving wife knocked on her door, actually start to talk. And a talking Paula was a variable I had not built into 3 years of silence. So we sat outside Paula's apartment building in Renata's car on a Wednesday evening, 2 women with cold gas station coffee going colder in the cup holders, and I did the thing I had been doing all week, which was participate in the hunt for myself so thoroughly and so helpfully that no one would ever think to look at the hunter. And then Paula came out of her building at 7 o'clock, and she did not walk to her car, and she did not go to a restaurant. She crossed the street to a second car, a dark one idling at the curb, and she leaned into the passenger window and spoke to a man I could not see, and she passed him a thick manila envelope through the glass, and she looked up and down the street once. Before she did it, the specific check of a person who has learned to look up and down a street. I felt Renata go rigid beside me. "That's him," she breathed. "That's the money. That's Claire. We're watching it. We're actually watching the—" And her hand was already going for her phone to photograph it, and I put my hand over hers, gently, and I said, "Wait. Get the plate, not the picture. A flash is a mistake," which was true, and was also the thing that kept a photograph of that envelope from ever existing, because I had recognized, in the half-second before the dark car pulled away, that the man in it was nobody. He was nobody. I had spent 3 years learning the whole cast of my husband's life, every number on the cloned gray phone, every face at the edges, and the man in that car was not on any of my maps, which meant he was not part of the machine, which meant this, the envelope, the furtive check, the dark, idling car, was Paula's own secret, a private thing running alongside the story we were in, and it had nothing to do with us at all. But Renata did not know that, and I could not tell her how I knew, and so I had to let her run it to ground, which cost us most of a day, and taught me something about the shape of a lie I have never forgotten. That the most dangerous red herring is not a false clue someone plants. It is a true secret that belongs to the wrong story. We ran the plate. We followed the thread. And the thread came apart in Renata's hands the next afternoon in the worst possible way, which is to say, gently, humanly, pitiably. The man in the dark car was a debt collector, a soft, private kind that families use when they do not want a paper trail, and the envelope was cash, and Paula was 3 years deep in her mother's nursing home arrears and had been quietly, desperately, illegally skimming David's expense float to keep an 84-year-old woman in a bed by a window. That was Paula's whole secret, not a conspiracy, a daughter. Renata sat in her car outside the nursing home, where we had finally followed the whole sad geometry of it, and she put her face in her hands, and she said, "It's not her," in a voice that had all the week's exhaustion in it, and I put my arm around her and told her it was good work, brave work, that ruling something out is how you find the truth. All the true and useless things you say to a person you are steering, and the entire time some cold clerk in the back of my mind was simply relieved, checking a box, noting that Paula was contained. A frightened woman with her own crime to hide would not be knocking on anyone's door. And moving on. That is what I was, that week. I could hold a crying woman with one arm and file her heartbreak as a resolved security concern with the other, and I did not yet know that the arm doing the holding was slowly, without my permission, becoming the reeler of the two. By the end of that day, Renata had crossed off the assistant, the imaginary investigator, an old girlfriend, a business partner, every human being she could think of who might have stood in 2 bedrooms with a camera, and she did not once cross off the woman in the passenger seat beside her, holding her coffee, running her plates, gently steering her away from every wall that had a door in it. I was the only suspect she never considered. I had made certain of that the way you make certain of anything, with patience, and it was working perfectly, and it was the loneliest I have ever been in my life. The whole time the real photograph sat in a folder on a phone in my glove box, taken by me, with keys I had cut myself, and I steered a grieving, frightened woman in careful circles around the truth of her own life, and she thanked me for it. She thanked me more than once for being the one clear head in the nightmare. And I would drive home from those afternoons and sit in my driveway and press the heels of my hands into my eyes, because being thanked by Renata was doing something to me that 3 years of cold planning had not prepared me to survive. And in the evenings I went inside, and I was David's wife. That is its own kind of endurance sport, and I had trained for it for 3 years, but that week it got harder, because David had started watching me the way I had spent 3 years watching him. I would look up from the stove and find his eyes on me, mild and warm and utterly attentive, a man taking a reading. He asked me, over dinner, in the most loving voice in the world, if everything was all right. I'd seemed far away. Was it work? Was it Chloe? Was it us? And I gave him a tired smile and a small, true-sounding worry about a friend going through a divorce, close enough to the truth to have a pulse, and I watched him accept it, or watched him appear to accept it, and I could no longer tell the difference, and the not being able to tell was new, and it frightened me. One night he came up behind me while I was washing the dishes, the gray kitchen, the black window, and he put his hands over mine in the warm water, and he said, into my hair, "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" And it was not a question, and it was not quite a threat. It was the thing that lives in the exact center of the two, and I turned in his arms and I kissed my sister's murderer on the mouth, and I said, "Of course I would. There's nothing I couldn't tell you." And I felt him decide, one more time, to keep believing me, and I understood that his deciding was a door that would not stay open much longer. Because here is what I had not accounted for in 3 years of planning. A predator and his prey, if they are both patient enough, both careful enough, begin, near the end, to hunt each other in a mirror. He was watching me go quiet. I was watching him watch me. And somewhere in that week, the two of us, without a word, entered a silent race that only one of us was going to finish. And I did not yet know that David had already, quietly, started running. I found out on a Thursday. I came home early, and his everyday phone was face down on the counter, and it lit up while he was in the shower, and I am a person who reads what lights up, and it was a message from a number with no name, and it said only, "Confirmed for Saturday. She's all yours." And I stood in my kitchen with the shower running down the hall and understood that my husband had booked something for Saturday, some service, some man, some plan, and that the she in the message was me, and that the week I thought we had was actually 2 days, and that the careful circles I had been walking Renata in had just run out of road. Chapter 5. We met a second time on the 4th day, and I want to tell you about it, because it is the day Renata stopped being a stranger I had chosen off a list and became a person I would have died for, and it is also the day I understood that the two of us were being watched by someone I could not account for, which, given that I was the one doing all the watching, should have been impossible. She picked the place this time, a playground, of all things, on the far edge of her city, mid-morning, the two of us on a bench at the cold end of October, while a scatter of toddlers we did not know ran the equipment behind us. She had brought Mateo's school picture without quite meaning to. It fell out of the folder, and she picked it up too fast, and I saw the boy, the cowlick, David's cowlick, my, Chloe's cowlick, and I had to look at the empty swings for a moment before I could speak. Renata talked about him the way frightened mothers talk, in logistics, because logistics are the only place the fear will hold still. Who would take him if? Where the good school was, whether 9 was old enough to be told any of it. and I sat there and did the arithmetic I had been avoiding for 4 days, which was that, if my plan went the way I had built it, this woman was going to spend the rest of her life knowing that the friend who saved her had also, coldly, chosen her, and that Matteo's whole future had been, to me at the start, a variable. "You keep going somewhere," Renata said. She had stopped talking about the school. She was looking at me, those steady, dark eyes, and I realized she had been reading me the way I read everyone, and that I had let her, which I never do. "In your head. You go somewhere, and the shutters come down. I've watched you do it 3 times now." She was not accusing. That was the worst of it. She said it gently. "Whatever it is, you're not telling me. And there's something, Claire. I'm not stupid. I need to know it's not going to get my son killed. That's all. That's the only thing I need." And I looked at a good woman on a cold bench asking me, essentially, whether I was safe to trust with her child's life. And I lied to her. I said, "There's nothing that touches Matteo. I promise you that." And it was at least a true lie. Nothing in my plan touched Matteo. And I have held on to that technicality on a great many nights since, the way you hold a splinter of wood in a flood. That is when I saw the car. It was parked across the street from the playground, a gray sedan, nothing car, and a man was in it, and he was not looking at his phone, which is what men in parked cars look at. He was looking at us. I clocked it the way 3 years of learning to be a hunter had taught me to clock it, without turning my head, and I felt every hair on my body stand up. Because here is the thing you have to understand. I knew where David was. I had spent 3 years always knowing where David was. It was the whole architecture of my life. He was that morning, provably, 90 minutes away at Renata's own emptied-out life, playing Michael. So the man in the gray car was not David, and it was not anyone I had hired, because I had hired no one. I did all of it myself. That was the entire point. One woman, no loose threads, which meant there was a thread in my perfect plan that I had not tied, a person in this story I had not cast, someone who was watching the 2 of us on a bench and taking, I would have bet my life, a photograph. "Don't turn around," I said to Renata very quietly, in the calm, flat voice that makes people obey before they've decided to. "Tell me about Matteo's school. Keep smiling. We're 2 moms on a bench." And she was magnificent. She did it. She talked about the school with her voice shaking only at the very bottom where a stranger wouldn't hear it. And I memorized the plate on the gray sedan over her shoulder. And after 90 long seconds, the car pulled out, unhurried, a man in no rush at all, the specific unhurry of someone who has gotten exactly what he came for. I did a foolish thing then. I told Renata I needed to use the restroom in the coffee place on the corner, and I walked her to her car first, and I watched her drive off toward Matteo's school, and then instead of going home, I got in my own car, and I went after the gray sedan, because I had to know, and knowing is the drug I have never been able to put down. I caught him at a light 4 blocks east. I stayed 2 cars back, the way you do, the way 3 years had taught me to, and I followed him onto the ramp and up the interstate toward my own city, my hands loose on the wheel and my whole body singing with the wrongness of it, because for 3 years I had been the one behind. I had never once been the one being led, and somewhere around the county line, in the flat gray light of a Tuesday afternoon, the sedan did a thing that turned my blood to water. It took an exit it did not need to take. It looped a clover leaf all the way around and came back onto the highway going the same direction. A full, unhurried circle, and I understood, sitting in the middle lane with my heart going sideways, that he had done it to see who came around behind him. He had made me. Not my face, I prayed, not my plate. I dropped back and let 3 cars slide between us and took the very next exit myself and sat in the parking lot of a farm supply store with my hand shaking on the wheel. But he had made the shape of me, a follower, a second hunter, a woman who did not behave like prey. And a man in his line of work does not shrug that off. He files it. He had come to the playground to photograph 2 frightened wives, and he was driving home having learned that one of the wives had followed him onto the interstate and known how to do it, and I had just, with my own arrogance, told the quietest man in my whole marriage that Claire was not what she appeared to be. That was the second time in a week I had handed my husband's side a piece of information for free. I did not know it was the second time. I would not understand the first until later. But I drove home the long way, checking my mirrors like a woman with a stalker, which is exactly what I had made myself into, and I sat in my driveway a long time before I could make my hands let go of the wheel. I ran the plate that night. It came back to a rental, paid in cash, a dead end, the kind of dead end a careful person leaves. And I sat in my dark house next to my sleeping husband and understood that the tidy story I had been telling myself, predator, prey, and the clever third woman who was secretly running them both, had one more character in it than I had written. Someone with their own camera and their own patience and their own reasons, and that I no longer knew, for the first time in 3 years, whether I was the one at the top of the board. Chapter 6. Let me tell you how a person becomes the third wife of a man who drowns his wives, because it is not an accident. Nothing about that man was ever an accident. And by the time I am finished, you will understand that nothing about me was either. Diane was my sister, not by blood, by the other way, the truer way. The way you get a sister when you are both 19 and broke and sharing a wall thin enough to hear each other cry through at 3 a.m. For 20 years, Diane was the person who knew all of me, the good and the buried, and I was that to her. I want to give you one night of her, because I have given you so much of the man and almost nothing of the woman he took, and that is its own kind of erasure, the exact one he specialized in, turning a whole human being into a plot point, a door, a case. So, one night, we were 19 and we shared a wall in a building that should have been condemned, and it was February, and the heat had failed in the whole block for 3 days, and we were both broke, in the particular airless way of girls who have already learned not to call home about it. I had been crying through that wall for a week. A boy, a job, the ordinary catastrophes of 19 that feel like the end of the world because you have not yet been shown the actual end of the world. And on the 3rd cold night I heard her knock, not on my door, on the wall, our old code, 3 taps, and I tapped back, and then I heard her voice come muffled through the plaster saying, "Open your window." And I opened my window, and it was freezing, and there she was leaning out of hers 18 inches away in every sweater she owned, holding a pot, an actual saucepan, of soup she had made on a hot plate that was against every rule of that building, steam coming off it into the black February air, and she passed it to me across the gap between 2 windows 4 stories up, both of us laughing and swearing and terrified of dropping it. And she said, "You have to eat something. You sound like a ghost. I can't sleep next to a ghost." And we sat on our 2 windowsills with the cold pouring in and passed 1 spoon back and forth across the gap until the pot was empty. And she did not once ask me to explain the crying, because she already knew that the thing about being 19 and heartbroken is that there is nothing to explain. There is only the not being alone in it. That was Diane. That was the whole of her, in one saucepan across 4 stories of freezing dark. She was the person who heard the ghost in your voice and got up and made soup. She swam every morning because when we were 22, she had watched a friend go under at a lake and had promised herself she would never be helpless in water again. And so she made herself strong in exactly the element that frightened her. 1/2 mile every dawn, for 20 years, in a gray tank suit, she refused to replace. Do you understand what he had to know about her? How closely he had to have studied her? To take a woman who had spent 2 decades making herself undrownable and drown her in 18 inches of her own bathwater and have a tired coroner call it a slip? That is not luck. That is craft aimed at the exact center of a person. He found the one fear she had beaten, and he walked her back into it and closed the door. And he did it so well that the world agreed she had simply been careless. She, of all people, in the one place she was never careless. When Renata slid that death certificate across the diner table and thought she was showing me a stranger, she was showing me the saucepan and the wall and the one spoon and 20 years of a voice that would not let me be a ghost. I had to look at the empty booth behind her for a moment before I could speak, and Renata thought it was shock, and it was, but not the shock she imagined. It was the shock of a woman hearing her own dead read aloud as evidence. When she met her charming traveling man, I was happy for her. God forgive me. I toasted them. And when she went quiet, in that slow way, the way a radio goes quiet when a hand turns it down 1 notch, and then a week later another notch and then another, until one day there is only a room where the music used to be, I told myself it was marriage. It was distance. It was the way friendships thin when one of you gets a whole new life. I told myself that for 2 years, and I have to live with those 2 years, because they were the years she was drowning by inches in a house I could have driven to, and I was busy respecting her privacy. Then Diane drowned all at once, in 18 inches of bathwater, a woman who swam every morning of her life, and her charming husband sold her paid-off house before the casseroles had gone bad and was gone. And I sat in the back pew of a funeral almost no one came to, because he had spent 4 years quietly cutting her off from everyone who might notice she was gone, and I made a decision that has cost me nearly everything I had, including more than once the person I used to be. I decided to find him, and I decided that when I found him, I was not going to hand him to a system that had already looked at Diane, face down and peaceful, and written the word accident, and gone to lunch. I had watched the law shrug once. I was not going to build my whole life around begging it to unshrug. So I did not go to the police. I did the colder thing, the thing that took the coldness I did not know I had, and grew it into an organ I could live inside. I learned him. It took me almost 2 years to find the man under his new names, tracing money and maple trees, and a dog-eared thriller he leaves on the nightstands of the women he studies. And when I finally found him, I did not warn his wives, and I did not call a detective. I got in line. I became, on purpose, brick by brick, exactly the woman a man like that hunts. I built an inheritance out of a small real amount Diane had quietly left me and a large amount of patient forgery, an aunt who never existed, a solid quiet fortune with no living relatives to ask about it. I bought a paid-off house I had no business affording in a city where I knew he worked. I made myself visible in the exact frequency that his kind of predator listens on. A settled, trusting, slightly lonely woman with money and no one to miss her. And he heard me. Of course he heard me. Listening for that frequency is the one thing he is genuinely gifted at. He approached me in a grocery store, of all the ordinary places, over a display of oranges, and I have thought since that he chose the oranges on purpose, something bright and domestic and warm, because everything that man does is chosen. He was charming in a way that did not announce itself. That was the terrifying craft of it. He did not sweep in. He arrived slowly, the way weather arrives, a little more present each week until one day you cannot remember the sky without him in it. He remembered things. He remembered the name of a cousin I'd mentioned once in passing, remembered how I took my coffee, remembered a worry I'd said out loud and forgotten saying, and produced it back to me weeks later, solved, wrapped, a gift. I knew, the entire time, exactly what he was. I had photographs of a bathtub in Ohio in a locked box in a storage unit across town, and I sat across candlelit tables from my sister's murderer and felt, against every wall I had built, the pull of being known that thoroughly, and I understood in my body then how Diane had gone under. He does not overpower a woman. He studies her until he can be, precisely, the one thing she has been missing her whole life, and then he becomes it, and you do not drown fighting a man like that. You drown grateful. I married him on a Saturday in October, which is the month Diane died, a fact I chose and he never knew he was standing inside. I wore a dress the color of bone, and in the middle of my own wedding during the first dance, with my sister's killer's hand warm on the small of my back and everyone I had hired to be my family smiling around us, I put my mouth close to his ear as if to say something loving, and what I said, so softly it died in the music, was her name, Diane. Just once. I needed to say it to him at least once while he held me. He did not hear it, but I did, and Diane did, wherever the dead keep the promises we make them, and I danced with the man who drowned her, and I began, that night, the 3 years of the coldest patience a human being has ever kept, sleeping beside him, smiling across 1,000 breakfasts, waiting to take him apart from the inside with his own method turned around in my hand. So, the photographs. I took them, both of them. I have keys to the cream-walled house because I have been, quietly, 3 steps ahead of my own husband for 3 years, following him the way he thinks he follows women. I have known about Renata for months, and 2 nights ago I sent 2 identical photographs to 2 phones, one of them my own, so that there would be a witness, not a co-victim, a witness, an honest, terrified, blind-sided wife with a real son named Matteo, and a real cowlick and real shock on her real face, a woman a detective would believe in a way that no detective would ever believe me. Me, with my invented aunt, and my forged inheritance, and my 3 years of premeditation. Me who married him on purpose, knowing exactly what he was. I cannot walk into a police station. I am, on paper, in motive, in method, the least believable woman in America. But Renata is real. Renata is the credible one. And I chose her, and I studied her, and I lit the fuse under her life 2 nights ago, and she does not know, sitting across from me in this vinyl booth, with the death certificate of a woman she thinks is a stranger between us, that the friend helping her survive her murderous husband selected her, months ago, off a list, for exactly this. That was the plan. I want to be honest about the plan before I tell you how it broke, because a plan is only as good as its author's willingness to say out loud where she stopped being able to follow it. I started to care whether Renata lived. It was not in the design. In the design, she was an instrument, a clean, believable mouth to say the true things I could not be believed saying. I had not planned to sit across from her 3 mornings running and watch her be brave and dryly funny and terrified and unspeakably decent. I had not planned for her to talk about Mateo's stutter and the way she still, God help her, missed the man she thought she'd married, the fictional good one, the way you miss a person who never existed. I had not planned for her to become, in the space of a week, the first human being since Diane to know a true thing about me. She thought she knew I was a fellow victim, and that was a lie. But she also came to know that I was steady, that I did not panic, that I would put my body between her and the dark, and those things were not lies. And it turns out you cannot be someone's rock for a week without some of the rock becoming real in your own chest. And while the two of us sat in diners becoming, against all my planning, something like actual sisters, my husband felt the ground move. Men like David always feel the ground move. It is the one true nerve they have. 2 wives gone quiet in the same season, 2 gray phones ringing less, a wife in the gray house who flinched, 1 degree, 1 single degree, when he kissed her temple over the coffee. He is a planner, and a planner does not sit and wonder about instability. A planner resolves it. He resolved it first, the way he did everything, gently, over dinner, with a story. It was the Wednesday of that week, the same day, though he did not know it, that I had sat outside Paula's building watching an envelope change hands. He cooked. That was already a small wrong note, because David cooked when he was managing me, and I had learned over 11 years to hear the knife on the board as a kind of weather report. He made the lemon chicken. He poured the wine. He asked about Chloe, and he listened to the answer, really listened, his chin on his hand, and then, in the pause after, in the most companionable voice in the world, he told me about a man he used to work with, years ago, another city. A good guy, David said, sharp. You'd have liked him. And this man had a wife, and the wife had gotten it into her head, near the end, that her husband was hiding something. Nothing was ever proven, David said, mildly, cutting his chicken. Nothing was ever there. But she got herself so worked up about it, so convinced, that she stopped sleeping, stopped eating right, started seeing things in shadows, and one night she ran a bath, and she'd had a little wine, and she'd had those pills doctors give you for the nerves, and David shrugged, and he did not finish the sentence, and he reached across my own table and refilled my glass that I had not touched, and he said, sad story. I always thought, if she'd just talked to somebody, if she'd just said the thing out loud instead of letting it eat her, you know? Half the tragedies in the world are somebody sitting on a feeling until it drowns them. And he smiled at me, warm, sorry, loving, and he held my eyes exactly 1 beat longer than a story needs, and he said, you'd talk to somebody, if it ever got to be too much. Right, Claire? I have sat across from that man for 11 years, and I have never been closer to death than I was over the lemon chicken, and no one raised a voice, and no threat was ever spoken. And if I had run to Reyes that night and repeated every word he said, she would have heard a husband telling a sad anecdote and gently worrying about his wife. That is the craft of him. He had just told me, in a story with no fingerprints on it, that he knew a woman could be nervous and sleepless and half convinced and end up face down in a bath with wine and pills, and that such a thing reads, to a tired coroner, as exactly what it is arranged to read as, and that the way to avoid becoming that story is to say the thing out loud, to him, now. He was offering me the bath and the exit in the same breath, and calling both of them love, and I looked at my husband, and I made my face do the thing it had done for 3 years, the small, grateful softening, and I put my hand over his on the table, and I said, I'd tell you anything, you know that, There's nothing in me you don't already have. And I watched him weigh it, and I watched him for one more night decide to be reassured, and I understood that I had just bought myself a little time by promising the hunter that the prey had nothing to hide, and that a man who tells you that story over dinner has already, somewhere behind those warm eyes, begun to run the bath. Chapter 7. I spent the 5th day hunting the man in the gray sedan, and what I found is the reason the 6th day nearly killed me, and the reason I finally understood that in 11 years of marriage, I had never once known my husband at all. The rental was a dead end, cash, false name, exactly as I'd expected. So I did the thing I am good at. I stopped chasing the car and started thinking like the man in it. A professional does not surveil 2 women on a playground bench for a cheating husband. A cheating husband does not hire surveillance on the woman he is cheating with. A professional surveils 2 targets when someone is preparing to make 2 targets disappear and wants to know their patterns, their exits, the exact texture of their ordinary days. The same reconnaissance, I realized with the floor going out from under me, that I had watched David himself do to me for a year before he proposed, and a man cannot be in 2 cities at once, doing that reconnaissance while also being, provably, a devoted husband 90 minutes away in each of them. So he doesn't. He has help. He has always had help. That is how one man drowns his wives, and is always, provably, somewhere else when it happens. There was a second person in my marriage, and there had been the whole time, and I had built a 3-year plan around a lone predator when I was actually standing inside a partnership. I found the fixer the way you find a careful person, which is by finding the one place they were not careful. David's gray phone, the one I was never to answer, I had cloned 18 months ago, quietly, one of the small thefts that patience buys you, and I had been reading its metadata ever since, without ever finding anything but coordinates and confirmations, a language with no nouns in it. But now I knew what I was reading. Now the strings of times and places had a second person on the other end of them, and when I laid the gray phone's history against the map of Diane's last month, and against the map of my own courtship, and against a playground bench 4 days ago, one number surfaced through all 3 like a body coming up in a lake. The same number, present at the edge of every important thing that had ever happened to me, for 3 years, and I had looked straight at it 100 times and seen only compliance, only work, only the smooth word my husband used to make me look away. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. with the cloned phone's history spread across my laptop in a spreadsheet I had built cell by cell over 18 months, and I did the thing I had been too proud and too certain to do before, which was to stop looking for what my husband had done and start looking for what someone had done to me. And it was all there. It had been there the whole time. The number had pinged a tower near my own street for 6 straight weeks in the autumn 3 years ago. 6 weeks I remembered as the loveliest of my life. The weeks David arrived like weather. The weeks he learned the name of a cousin I'd mentioned once, and how I took my coffee. I had thought David studied me himself. He had not. He had sent the quiet man to sit outside my house and learn my patterns and photograph my exits and my locks and my ordinary days. The same reconnaissance I had just watched aimed at me from a playground bench, and then David had walked into the grocery store over the oranges, already holding the file, already knowing which frequency to listen on, because the quiet man had handed it to him. My whole courtship, the thing I had believed in my arrogance, that I was running as a trap on him, had itself been a surveillance operation running on me, months before I ever thought I'd chosen him. I had walked into that grocery store believing I was the hunter arriving on schedule. I had actually been prey that a second, invisible man had already spent 6 weeks mapping. 2 hunters had been standing over me from the very first orange, and I had counted only one, and I had counted him as my mark. I want to describe what that did to a person who had built her entire self, brick by cold brick, on the certainty that she saw the board more completely than anyone else at the table. It was not fear exactly. It was vertigo. It was the specific nausea of a woman who has just learned that the room she thought she'd been secretly controlling for 3 years had a second door she'd never seen, and a man standing quietly in it the whole time, watching her congratulate herself. And so I did the recklessest thing I did in the whole 3 years, and I did it because I could not stand not to have a face. The cloned phone's history had one location that repeated, a nothing address on the industrial edge of my own city, a low brick building with a roll-down door and a sign for a company that did not exist, the kind of address a careful man uses because it is boring. I drove there at dusk. I told myself I would only look. I parked across the wide empty street between a box truck and a dumpster, and I watched the roll-down door, and after 40 minutes it went up, and the gray sedan came out. The same sedan. The playground sedan. And it stopped at the mouth of the lot while the door came back down behind it, and in that pause, in the last of the light, the driver turned his head and looked directly across the street, at the space between the box truck and the dumpster where I was sitting with my lights off, and my heart stopped. I will never know if he saw me. That is the thing about the quiet ones. They give you nothing, not even the mercy of knowing. He looked for perhaps 3 seconds, unhurried, the same unhurry as the playground, a man reading a street the way I read a street. And then he turned back and pulled out and was gone, and I sat there in the dark with both hands over my mouth. But I had my face. Older than I'd pictured, gray at the temples, a wide, flat, calm face with nothing moving in it, a face you would forget the instant it left a room, which is of course the whole point of a face like that. It is a tool honed to be forgotten, the way David's charm was a tool honed to be remembered, the two of them the same instrument built in opposite directions. I drove home knowing what the second man looked like, and terrified that the trade had gone both ways, that in buying his face I had shown him mine a second time, and that somewhere in that low brick building a careful man was now adding a detail to a file with my name on it. She came here. She knows. About here. Move the timeline up. That is when the 6th day arrived, and with it the message I have already told you about, face down on my counter, glowing while the shower ran. That is when the 6th day arrived, and with it the message I have already told you about, face down on my counter, glowing while the shower ran. Confirmed for Saturday. She's all yours. I had assumed, when I first read it, that some anonymous service had given my husband a green light. I understood now that it was not anonymous, and it was not a service. It was the partner. It was the fixer telling David that the reconnaissance was complete, that my patterns were mapped, that my Saturday was clear and my exits were known and my death was, logistically, ready to be convenient. The 2-day countdown I thought I had discovered was not a countdown my husband had started. It was a countdown 2 professionals had finished, and I had spent the reconnaissance window they were closing around me sitting on a playground bench, being watched, holding a good woman's hand, telling her there was nothing that could touch her son. I want to tell you that I stayed cold. I have prided myself through this entire account on the cold. But on the 6th day, alone in my kitchen with the shower running and a dead sister, and a fixer's confirmation glowing up at me from the counter. I sat down on my own kitchen floor, in the gray room, with my back against the cabinet, and I shook. Not for long, a minute, maybe 2, the way the water goes flat and black and gives nothing back, because 3 years of my plan had just been revealed as the plan of a woman who thought she was hunting one man and was in fact standing, mapped and photographed and scheduled inside the crosshairs of 2, and the whole architecture of what I was going to do on Saturday. The recorder, the confession, the trap I had built around a single arrogant killer who believed he was alone, was now aimed at a man who was not alone, who had a partner in a gray sedan somewhere close, watching, and who would not simply be arrested and gone, because you can trap one predator with his own arrogance, the second one, the quiet one, the one who does the watching and leaves cash-paid dead ends and never once feels safe enough to say anything out loud into any recorder. That one does not get caught in a bathroom. That one walks away and remembers your face, and is patient, exactly as patient as I am, and has now been paid to think of you as unfinished business. I got up off the floor. I turned off the shower, feeling in my chest, the shaking, the way you turn off a tap, and I understood that Saturday was no longer a plan I was springing. It was a plan I was walking into, knowing the trap I'd built had a second set of jaws I hadn't accounted for, and that the only way out was not to be cleverer than my husband, which I already was, but to be cleverer than the man I had never once seen, and to do it in the next 36 hours with a daughter to protect, a witness to keep alive, and no idea in the world what the fixer looked like without a windshield in the way. Chapter 8. Before I tell you what I did with the 2 nights, I have to tell you about the woman I found on the 5th night, because she is the reason I did not run, and because she is the closest I came in 3 years to walking into a police station and setting fire to my whole plan to save a stranger whose face I had seen exactly twice. I found her the way I found the fixer, in the cloned gray phone, once I finally knew how to read it. For 18 months, that phone had given me nothing but coordinates and confirmations, a language with no nouns in it, and I had read it every night the way you worry a sore tooth, learning nothing, only aching. But a map you cannot read is still a map, and once I understood there was a second man, on the far end of those numbers, the whole grammar of the thing changed under my eyes, and I saw what I had been staring past for a year and a half. A new rhythm had started, a fresh number, 3 weeks old, pinging a tower in a town an hour the other side of Renata's, out where the interstate goes to 2 lanes, and the strip malls give way to hardware stores and churches with reader boards. Tuesday mornings, early. Thursday evenings, the 7 o'clock hour, the soft, ordinary hours. And I knew that rhythm the way you know a song from the first 2 notes, played on a wrong instrument, because it was the negative of my own. It was the exact 6-week shape the quiet man had once beaten out on the pavement of my own street, 3 autumns ago, sitting outside my house learning when I left and when I came home, and which window I stood at to drink my coffee. It was a courtship in its reconnaissance phase. Somewhere, an hour past Renata, a woman was being mapped. I should have left it alone. Every hour of the little time I had left belonged to Saturday, to Renata, to the file and the recorder, and the daughter I had to get clear of the house. But I have told you already that knowing is the drug I have never been able to put down, and there is a special helplessness in a woman who has spent 3 years unable to save the one person she buried, when she is handed the coordinates of the next one, while the next one is still alive. So on the 5th night, with David provably an hour and a half away being Michael, I drove out past the 2-lane stretch to the town on the reader board edge of nowhere, and I found the tower, and I found, without much trouble, because a small town keeps its lonely people in plain sight, the woman on the other end of the new number. Her name was Ellen. I want to say it, because no one in the whole architecture of what I did ever said any of our names out loud in time, and I am trying, now, late, to be a person who says the name before the water runs. She was 53. She had the specific untended grief of a woman 2 years widowed, the grief that has stopped being sharp, and become instead a kind of weather she lives inside, a gray she has decorated and made livable and no longer expects to leave. She had a paid-off house on a street of maples turning. She had a son who taught English somewhere across an ocean and called on Sunday afternoons, which meant she had 6 other afternoons that no one checked. She had money, not a fortune, the good quiet kind, a husband's pension and a paid-off house, and the ordinary responsible policy married people buy each other and forget. And she had, most of all, the thing his kind listens for, the way a dog hears a whistle a mile off, no one close enough to notice, for a good long while, if she went quiet by inches. I sat across the square from the little Saturday market in my nothing car, with a coffee going cold in the holder, and I watched her buy apples and a bunch of dahlias, and stop to let a stranger's dog smell her hand, and I watched the machine begin. He came the way weather comes. I have described it to you from the inside, how you cannot remember the sky without him in it. But I had never once watched it happen to another woman from across a square, and I am telling you, it was the most frightening thing I saw in 3 years of frightening things. More than the bathtub filling at 2:40, more than the gray sedan looping the clover leaf to see who followed. Because from the outside you can see the whole apparatus, and it is smooth, and it is patient, and it is kind. He did not sweep in. He was 2 stalls down, and a gust took the dahlias half out of her arms, and he caught them before they hit the bricks, and handed them back stem first, already half turned away, apologizing for the wind as if the wind were his. And that was all. That was the entire first move. No number, no coffee, no lean. Just a small, competent kindness and a warm, retreating shape. And I watched Ellen's face over the top of my cold cup, and I watched it do the thing, the slow lighting, the 1 degree of thaw in the gray weather, the startled small surprise of a person who has stopped expecting to be met, being precisely met. It is the loveliest thing in the world to feel, and the most terrible thing in the world to watch, because I knew what my own face had done over a display of oranges 3 autumns ago, and now I was the audience to it. And I understood at last exactly what I had looked like the day I walked into my sister's murderer's sights, believing I was the hunter, arriving on schedule. And then I did the arithmetic, sitting there, and the arithmetic is the reason the rest of the night went the way it did. He was not waiting for me to be dead to begin Ellen. He was beginning Ellen now, this month, this Saturday, while he was closing me. The overlap was not sloppiness. It was the design, the same design that had let one man be 2 husbands for 11 years, the same tooth and groove fit that had made Renata's calendar the photographic negative of mine. A careful widower does not sit alone in a gray house the weekend his wife has her sad accident in the bath. He is elsewhere, and he is charming, and he is visibly, wholesomely beginning again, an hour and a half away, catching a stranger's flowers in the wind. Ellen was not the next job, filed for after Saturday. Ellen was part of why Saturday was scheduled at all. She was the alibi being built in real time, a living woman turned into the place he would provably be while I went under, exactly the way my own lit-up trusting house had once been the place he was provably sleeping, while, 90 minutes away, someone else's terrible Tuesday was arranged. I had spent 3 years understanding that Renata and I were each other's cover stories. I had not understood until I watched a gust of wind lift a bunch of dahlias that the machine never stopped needing new cover, and that it made it out of women, one at a time, the way a fire makes smoke. I could have warned her. I want you to know I sat in that car and let myself have it, the whole clean, simple, decent version of the night where I get out and cross the square and take a stranger by the elbow and say quietly, "Run. That man is not weather, that man is a drowning, I have the pictures." It would have felt like the thing Diane deserved from someone once and never got, and it would have killed Ellen. I made myself follow it all the way down because a person who is about to choose the cold thing owes it to everyone to first walk the warm thing to its actual end. If I warned Ellen, Ellen would flinch, and he would feel it. Men like him feel the ground move. It is the one true nerve they have. I have watched it twitch across a breakfast table for 11 years. And he would fold the whole operation up overnight and become, for the 10th time, a man who was simply somewhere else, gone into the middle distance of the country, and the trap I had spent 3 years and buried my sister to build would close on empty air. He would walk, and Ellen would still, eventually, in some town I would never find, on some Thursday I would never know to fear, go quietly under, because the only thing warning her accomplished was teaching my husband that a wife could be warned. The single way to save the woman across the square was to leave her exactly where she was for 6 more days, on the hook, in the weather, being courted by a killer, and to spring Saturday so clean and so complete that the machine came apart before it ever reached her bath. So I did the coldest thing in a cold 3 years, which does not look like anything at all. I finished my coffee, and I wrote nothing down, because a careful person leaves no paper, and I put Ellen's name and her street and the shape of her gray weather into the one place I keep the things that matter, which is the back of my own skull, behind my own eyes, and I drove home an hour and a half in the dark, carrying a second innocent life, in the same hand that already held Renata's and Chloe's, and not one of the 3 of them knew I was carrying them. I told Renata about her the next morning, on the phone, in the whisper I used while David slept. I had not meant to. It was not in the plan to hand my honest witness one more terror to hold, but I had learned that week that Renata was the one place I had left to set anything down, and I said it before I decided to. There's another one, Renata. He's already started another one. An hour past you. I watched him do it. And there was a silence on the line, and then Renata said a thing I have carried since, in the flat, fierce voice she used when she had stopped being afraid and started being something harder. "Then we don't get to be tired, Shek-Yen," she said. "I was going to let myself be tired after Saturday. We don't get to." And she was right, and it was the first time in the whole nightmare that someone made a decision I had not steered her into, and I lay in the dark beside my sleeping husband and understood that the instrument I had chosen off a list had begun, quietly, to pick up the other end of the thing and carry it with me, unasked. Ellen never knew she had 2 women in interstate away who had decided, in the dark, that she was going to live. That is the only kind of saving I have ever been any good at, the kind the saved never find out about. But it was, that morning, enough to get me up off the floor and into the last 2 nights, and I have never in my life needed a reason to keep going the way I needed one that week. And then somewhere on the black interstate coming home, the ground moved under me one more time, the way it had been moving all week. Each time I thought I had finally found the floor, because it had been too easy. I want you to understand what I mean, because it took me 40 miles of dark road to let myself see it. For 18 months, that cloned phone had given me nothing but scrubbed coordinates, a careful man's careful exhaust, times and towers, and not one soft edge to hold. A man who leaves cash-paid rentals and loops a clover leaf to burn a tail does not, one Tuesday, start beating out a clean, legible courtship rhythm that a stolen phone can read like a church bulletin. He does not leave a new woman's town sitting in the metadata, like an apple on a table, unless he wants it read, unless the leak, the possibility of a leak, a suspicion he could not confirm and could not, being who he was, ignore, had finally cost him enough sleep that he put a line in the water to see if it would twitch. Ellen was the line. The clean new pattern was bait, and not for me the way I'd first felt it, bait to save her from. Bait for the watcher he suspected was reading over his shoulder, a bright, easy thing dangled to see who would come running out to a nothing town on a 2-lane road on the 5th night, before a Saturday. And I had come. Of course I had come. Knowing is the drug, and he had counted on the drug, because he is the kind of man who counts. And I had driven 90 minutes each way to prove to a gray, flat, calm face that the leak was real, was a person, was a woman who could not leave a rescue alone, which meant the phone was poisoned, which meant 18 months of everything I believed I had stolen from him might have been, some of it, most of it. I would never now know how much, a thing I had been permitted to see. My one secret advantage, the buried root of the whole 3 years, was a well the quiet man had maybe always known I was drinking from. I drove the last 20 miles with my hands cold on the wheel and understood that I was going into Saturday with a map my enemy might have drawn and no time left to make another. And I made, on that dark road, the last and coldest decision of the 3 years, which was to drink from the poisoned well on purpose. Because there was one thing I had learned that was true of both of them, the loud man and the quiet one. True all the way to the bottom. Neither could conceive of not being the person writing the scene. The fixer would assume that feeding me Ellen had aimed me, tired me, hurted me where he wanted. It would never once occur to him that I would take the Fed map and the real 18 months rotting underneath it, and carry the entire poison thing straight into a detective's hands, because handing your enemy your own corrupted weapon and letting him watch you do it is not a move a clever person makes. It is a move you make only after you have stopped needing to be the clever one. He had spent, I would have bet my life, a great deal of care making sure I could not trust the phone. He had not spent 1 second imagining I would use it anyway, out loud, on the record, and let his own arrogance about having tainted it become the thing that hanged him. 2 men had spent years certain they were writing me. I was going to let them keep the pen right up until the last page, because whatever else I had become, I was not going to be a second time. The woman who respected the quiet and let the radio go down 1 notch at a time until there was only a room where the music used to be. I had been that woman once. It cost me Diane. It was not going to cost me Ellen or Renata or the girl asleep down the hall. I got up. I set the table for Saturday. Chapter 9. 2 nights. That was what the message on the counter had bought me. And I want to tell you what a person does with 2 nights when she has spent 3 years getting ready and just found out the exam has been moved up and just found out she has been studying for the wrong exam entirely. The first thing I understood, sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot with my hands flat on the wheel to keep them still, was that I could not simply run. Every cell in my body wanted to take Chloe and drive, and every cell was wrong. If I ran, David would know in an hour, and a man who plans a year ahead does not chase a runaway wife through a rainstorm. He simply becomes, overnight, a widower whose unstable wife vanished, and he keeps my money in my daughter's trust fund, and the story writes itself, because he is very, very good at stories. And worse, if I ran, he walked, free, to Renata's bathtub, and then to the next quiet woman with an inheritance, and no one to miss her. Running saved me and doomed everyone who came after me, and I had not buried Diane and spent 3 years in a murderer's bed to save only myself. So I did not run. I set the table for Saturday, his table, the one he thought he was setting for me. I had the file. I had been building it for 3 years, in a storage unit across town, in a box behind a false panel. The death certificate, the coroner's shrug, the maple trees, the 2 paid-off houses, the timeline of his absences laid against a calendar of Diane's last months. All of it, patient and complete. What I did not have, what I had never had, was a way to hand it over that anyone would believe. Because the moment a detective looked at me, Claire, with the forged aunt, the invented inheritance, the 3 years of premeditated marriage to a man I knew was a killer, I stopped being a witness and became a suspect. A woman with motive stacked to the ceiling, and my file became the paranoid scrapbook of a wife who wanted her husband gone. I had known this for 3 years. It was the wall I had never found the door in. And then, 90 minutes away, the door had grown a face and a son named Matteo, and a real, blameless, believable life. Renata. I needed Renata to be the one who walked the file into a police station, because Renata was clean. So the first of my 2 nights I spent not preparing to kill my husband, but preparing a grieving, frightened woman to save both our lives. And I did it over the phone in a whisper while David slept 8 inches from me, breathing his even, untroubled breaths. I told her more than I had ever told her, and less than everything. I told her I had learned things about Diane, about the pattern, that I could prove, that I had built a file, over months, that laid the whole thing out. I did not tell her I was Diane's sister. I did not tell her I had married him on purpose. I could not give her that yet, not on the phone, not with what was coming. I told her only what she needed to be brave and be ready. And I gave her one word, a single word we agreed on, and I told her what it meant, that if she ever received that word from me, it meant he had decided. It meant tonight, and it meant she did not call me back, did not text, did not wait to be sure. She called the detective whose name I gave her, the one I had spent weeks quietly deciding could be trusted, and she sent the file I had already routed to her, and she drove to the gray house, and she did not stop. Why me? Renata asked me, in the dark, 90 minutes away. And her voice was so tired and so frightened and so unwilling to leave her son without a mother that it went into me like a blade. Why do I have to be the one to carry it? Because they'll believe you, I said, which was true, and was the cruelest true thing I have ever said to a person I was beginning to love, because I had chosen her for exactly the quality that was now terrifying her. Her realness, her cleanness, the very innocence that made her the perfect instrument. Because you have nothing to hide, Renata, and that is the one thing in this whole nightmare that nobody can take away from you. She was quiet a long time, then she said, Okay, for Matteo, and for the woman in the bathtub, and she did not know, could not know, that she had just agreed to be the honest face of a scheme she had never consented to. and I lay in the dark beside my sleeping husband and hated myself with a completeness that felt almost like prayer. I have to tell you about the detective, because she was not luck. Nothing in 3 years was luck. The name I gave Renata that night, Detective Marisol Reyes, was a name I had earned the right to trust the way I earned everything, by testing it in the cold, months before I ever needed it. Because the one wound at the very center of me, the thing 3 years of planning had been built around and against, was a tired coroner in a small, quiet county who had looked at my sister face down in 18 inches of water and written the word accident and gone to lunch. I had watched the law shrug over Diane's body, and I was not going to hand the most important night of my life to a second shrug. So a few months earlier, when the shape of the end game was starting to come clear to me, I had done a strange and careful thing. I had gone looking for a detective the way you audition someone for a part they must never know they are playing. I did it obliquely. I reported a prowler, a real enough thing, a shadow at my own back fence I half believed in and half invented, the kind of report a nervous suburban wife makes and a police department files under nothing. And then I watched what the department did with a piece of nothing. I watched which detective the desk handed it to, and I watched to see whether that detective did what the coroner in Ohio had done, which is nothing, or whether she did the other thing. And Reyes did the other thing. Reyes, whom I had never met, pulled the report on a nothing prowler and actually came. She knocked on 2 of my neighbors' doors. She walked my back fence line in the rain with a flashlight and found the one place a person could stand unseen and stood in it herself, testing the sight line into my kitchen. And then she left me a card and a callback and a small, unshowy competence that told me everything. She was a person who did not shrug. She was a person who, handed a shadow, went and stood where the shadow would have stood. And I took her card and I put it in the box in the storage unit behind the false panel, next to the death certificate and the maple trees. And I marked her, months before Renata existed to me, as the one door in the wall of the shrugging law that might actually open. When the night came, I did not gamble on a stranger. I spent Renata's honesty on a detective I had already quietly proven. And on the second night, David almost found the recorder. I had carried it for 3 years, a small thing, in the pocket of a cardigan I wore so often he had stopped seeing it. 3 years of a careful man saying nothing, waiting for the one warm night he'd feel safe enough to say everything. And on that second night he came up behind me at the sink, the way he did, and he put his arms around me, and his hand brushed the pocket, and I felt the small hard shape of it against his palm through the wool, and the whole world stopped. He paused, 1 second, 2, the longest 2 seconds since the ones on a dock. No, this was my own life. There was no dock. But that is how time went. It went like the water going flat and black. And then David said, "What have you got in here? You're always squirreling things away." And his fingers began to close on the pocket. And I turned inside his arms, fast, and kissed him. And I said, "Just my phone. My hands were wet." And I slipped the cardigan off my shoulders in the same motion, casual, warm, a wife getting comfortable. And I draped it over the chair, across the room, while I kissed him. And I walked my murderer backward toward the couch with my mouth on his, and 3 years of evidence hanging on a chair 8 feet away, and I did not let him feel my heart, which was going like a fist on a locked door. That is the closest I came to the bathtub before Saturday. 2 seconds and a cardigan. I have thought about it every day since. And then, a few hours later, still on that second night, I nearly died a night early, and the reason I did not is that it was never actually the night. But I had no way in the dark to know that, and I lived a whole death in the not knowing. I woke at 2:40 because the bed beside me was empty and cold, not warm empty the way a bed is when a man has just stepped out of it. Cold, empty. He had been up for a while, and I lay there in the gray room with my eyes open in the dark, and I heard, down the hall, the sound that stopped my heart. Water. Running water. The slow, deliberate thunder of a tub filling in the middle of the night, in a house where the only two people awake were me and the man who drowned his wives. And I understood. I was certain. I would have sworn it on Chloe's life, that the message on the counter had lied about the day, or that he had moved it up because he'd felt me flinch, and that it was happening now, tonight, and that everything I had built for Saturday was 2 rooms away and useless, because Saturday was not coming. This was. I have never in my life been so afraid and so still at the same time. I did the arithmetic of my own murder in about 4 seconds, flat on my back, staring at the ceiling. The recorder was in the cardigan on the chair. Good, close. Reyes was a phone call away, but a phone call takes minutes, and a bathtub takes seconds. Chloe was at the sleepover. Thank God, the one clean fact. And Renata had the word, but I had not sent it, because I had been asleep. Because for the first time in 3 years I had let myself sleep. My hand found my phone under the pillow. My thumb was over Renata's name, and I made myself wait. The hardest wait of my life, harder than 3 years, because 3 years had been patience, and this was the opposite of patience. This was holding perfectly still with a blade descending, because I knew that if I sent the word, and it was nothing. If I brought Reyes and Renata screaming up my street at 2:40 in the morning to find my husband running a bath because he couldn't sleep, I would burn the entire trap on a false alarm, and David would know, and David would simply become the widower-in-waiting of a wife who'd had a hysterical episode, and Diane would go unavenged, and the next quiet woman would go under. So I waited. I lay in my own bed and let the water run, and waited to find out whether I was about to be murdered, because sending the alarm too early was, in its way, as fatal as not sending it at all. And then the water shut off, and I heard him get in, and I heard him, a moment later, sigh, the long, ordinary, bone-tired sigh of a man easing into hot water at 3 in the morning because his own body had betrayed him with insomnia, a man soaking his own tired shoulders, alone, a man who was not, that night, thinking about me at all. He had run himself a bath, that was all. The predator, it turns out, sometimes just cannot sleep and takes a bath, like anyone. I lay in the dark and shook with the specific full-body tremor of adrenaline that has nowhere to go, and I listened to my husband bathe himself in the room where he intended, in 30 hours, to bathe me, and I understood 2 things that I carried into Saturday like stones in both pockets. The first was that I could not afford to sleep again until it was over. The second, worse, was that I had just proven to myself I would hesitate, that at the actual edge, with the actual water running, I would wait 1 beat too long rather than spend the trap early, and that David, if he ever gave me a real version of this exact moment, would have that 1 beat to work with. I had found the flaw in my own machine at 2:40 in the morning, and its name was the same as his. The certainty that I would see it coming. By Saturday morning the trap was set, as much as it would ever be. Renata had the word and the name and the file and the nerve. The recorder was charged and back in the pocket. And I made Chloe her cinnamon toast and kissed the top of her head and arranged, in the most ordinary voice in the world, for her to have a sleepover at a friend's that night, because whatever happened in the gray house after dark, my daughter was not going to be in it. I had, at the outside, one more day, and then it was not one more day, because that afternoon... Chapter 10. On Saturday, the day that unnamed number had promised him, the day I had 2 nights to get ready for and used every hour of, David came home to the gray house early. He came in smiling with a bottle of the red I like, and he set it on the counter, and he came up behind me and put his hands on my sore shoulders. The shoulders he knew were sore, because I had told him, foolishly, weeks ago, back when I still thought I had all the time in the world. "You've been carrying the whole world lately," he said, and he pressed his thumbs into the knots with the exact tenderness that had fooled a smarter woman than me straight into her grave. "Let me run you a bath, glass of wine, hot water. I'll handle Chloe. You just go soak until you're a person again." And I stood at my own kitchen counter with my husband's careful hands on my shoulders and the sound of him already moving toward the bathroom, toward the taps. And I understood, with a calm that frightened me more than fear would have, that after 3 years of waiting, my husband had just decided it was my turn for the bathtub, and that I had, at the outside, 1 hour. Here is what I did with my hour, and I did it with my heart going like a fist on a locked door, and I want it told in order, because the order is the only thing that saved my life. The first thing I did was run the bath myself. I need you to understand that choice, because it is the hinge the whole night turns on. I went into that bathroom ahead of him, and I ran the water loud and hot, and I did it so that the plan he thought was his could keep on feeling like his, because in 3 years of lying beside that man, I had learned the one true thing about him, which is that he has never once, not for a single second, suspected that he was not the person writing the scene. He cannot conceive of it. It is the flaw at the very center of him, the same flaw that let him drown Diane and marry me. He believes, always, totally, that he is the hunter, and the other person is the prey, and a man that's certain will walk directly into a room you have prepared for him, as long as you let him believe he chose the room. The second thing I did, while the water thundered into the tub and covered every other sound in the house, was take out my everyday phone and send Renata a single word. We had agreed on it 3 days earlier, in the diner, on the small chance a night like this ever came. I had not told her everything. I had not told her what I have told you, but I had told her enough. I had said, if either of us ever texts the other this one word, it means he has decided. It means tonight. And it means you do not call me. You do not text back. You call the detective, and you send the file, and you drive. And you do not wait to be sure. Because weeks before, quietly, without ever showing Renata the whole of my hand, I had built the 2 of us a door. I had taken everything, the death certificate, the maple trees, the 2 paid-off houses, the pattern, the years, and I had assembled it into a file so complete, so patient, so undeniable, that all a detective would ever have to do was believe one credible, terrified wife and follow the map I had already drawn. I sent Renata the word. Then I turned my phone face down on the sink, and I picked up my glass of wine, and I picked up his, and I carried them into the warm, loud room to my husband, and I did the last thing, the thing that 3 years of my one wild life had been building toward. I got him talking. You have to understand what a man like David is starved for. He has spent his whole life being the smartest person in every room and never, not once, being able to tell a living soul. The cleverness has nowhere to go. It sits in him like a held breath, and I had learned that if you give that kind of man a warm room, and an open bottle, and a soft, adoring audience, and this is the terrible part, the part I did on purpose, the total private certainty that the audience will be dead within the hour, and can therefore be told anything, he will eventually, if you are patient, if you have been patient for 3 years, begin to enjoy himself. He will begin to reminisce. I sat on the edge of the tub in the steam with my glass in my hand, and I looked at my husband with 3 years of manufactured love in my eyes, and I asked him softly, like a wife who wanted to understand her clever man, whether he had ever loved any of it, any of the life, before me. And I let him mistake the question for tenderness. And a man who has never been caught, given that room and that bottle and that certainty, will tell you in the end about Diane. He told me about Diane. He did not call her Diane at first. He called her the one before, the way you'd refer to a house you used to own, and he swirled the wine and looked at the steam and said, "You'd have liked her, actually. She was like you, steady. People think I go for the fragile ones, and it's the opposite. The fragile ones make noise. They call their sisters. They leave a diary. The steady ones are the gift. A steady woman decides you're safe, and then she just stops checking. She hands you the whole house and goes to sleep in it." He smiled at me then, warm, proud, a craftsman describing a joint that had held for years. "That's not cruelty, Claire. I want you to understand that, because you always want to understand things. It's one of the things And he stopped, and he drank, and he started again in the reasonable voice, the dinner voice, the voice that had walked a smarter woman than me to the water's edge. "It isn't hatred. I've never hated one of them. Hating them would be a kind of attention, and the whole point is the absence of attention. You just decide, at the start, quietly, that a person is going to be a door instead of a room, and then you're very kind to the door. You're kinder to it than anyone's ever been, and on the last day you open it." He said it so gently. "That is the thing I need you to hear, the thing no recording can carry," that every unspeakable word came out wrapped in the warmest voice I have ever heard, a lullaby with a body count. "She wasn't afraid," he said, "of Diane, of my Diane, of the girl on the other side of a thin wall at 3 a.m. for 20 years. That's the mercy in it, if you're any good. She was tired, and the water was warm, and I sat on the edge of the tub and told her a story about a trip we were going to take, and she closed her eyes to see it, and—" He lifted one hand out of the water and let it fall back, a small splash, done. People make it violent in their heads. It isn't. It's the least violent thing in the world if you've spent the years right. It's just the last kindness. It's turning the radio down one more notch. And there it was, the exact image out of his own mouth, the radio going down a notch at a time, the image I had carried for 3 years without ever knowing it was his, that I had felt him do to Diane from the outside and had watched him do to Ellen across a market square, handed back to me now as his own private philosophy of murder, offered across the steam as intimacy, as the deepest thing he had, because a man who has been the smartest and the loneliest person in every room for his whole life will, given a warm room and an open bottle, and a woman he is certain will be dead within the hour, finally, gratefully, tell the one person he thinks is safe to tell exactly how he turned the music off on my sister. He told me smiling, swirling the wine, his voice low and warm and horribly relaxed, a man finally setting down a held breath he'd carried for years, and every word of it went into the small recorder I had carried in the pocket of my cardigan every single day for 3 years. The recorder that had captured 1,000 hours of a careful man saying nothing at all, waiting the way I had waited for the one warm night he finally felt safe enough to say everything. He was still talking, still smiling, still enjoying the unique relief of being known when the headlights came up the drive. 2 sets, Renata's car, and behind it the plain sedan of a detective who had spent a week holding a file so complete that all she had needed, in the end, was to believe a real wife and drive 90 minutes in the dark. I watched my husband's face change. I had waited 3 years to see it. I watched the warm, clever mask come off, feature by feature, and the real face rise up underneath it at last. The face Diane must have seen for 1 second in the water, the face that has no charm in it at all because charm was only ever the tool. And this flat, cold nothing is the man. And I stood up, out of the steam, away from him, and I moved toward the door and the light coming up the drive, and I turned around once, in the doorway, and I said the only sentence I had wanted to say for 3 years, the sentence I had married him to be able to say. "My name isn't Claire," I told him, "and that bath was never going to be mine." They took him out of the gray house in handcuffs at 11:40 at night, and he did not say another word, because he had already said every word that mattered, into a recorder in a cardigan pocket, over the sound of running water he had believed was digging my grave. But David was never the whole of it, and I had known that for 36 hours, and closing the second half of the trap was the thing I had spent my last 2 nights on, that no one watching will ever fully see. Because the moment I understood there was a partner, the man in the gray sedan, the voice that had confirmed Saturday, I understood that springing my trap on David alone would only leave the quiet one loose, patient, paid, and holding my face in his memory as unfinished work. So I had done the last cold thing. The gray phone I had cloned 18 months before, the one full of coordinates with no nouns in it, I gave to the detective entire, and I sat with her and showed her how to read it the way I had finally learned to. Every confirmation, every job, every place a certain number had stood at the quiet edge of a woman's last month, going back years. It was not a thing a tired coroner could shrug at. It was a map of 2 men's work in the partner's own hand, and so the detective who came for David that Saturday did not come alone either. There was a second car, dark, waiting down the block, because I had told her exactly where the fixer would be, close enough to confirm the accident, the way he had been close enough to confirm every accident before mine. They took him in that gray sedan 40 yards from my house, a long lens still warm on the seat beside him, watching the window, waiting to see me go under. I made myself watch it. After they had folded David down into the first car, while Renata stood shaking in the driveway, I walked past her, out to the end of my own lawn, into the cold, because I had to see the second one with my own eyes, or I would never in my life believe he was real. Reyes had put a quiet word out the moment she pulled up. I had told her the make, the color, the 40-yard sightline, the habit of parking where a streetlight was out. And down the block, in the dark between 2 houses where a careful man would sit, a second unit came up on the gray sedan, with no lights and no sirens, the way you approach a man who might do something sudden, and there was a long, still moment when nothing happened at all, when the whole street held its breath, and then the interior light of the sedan came on, and I saw him. For the 3rd time and the last, the wide, flat, calm face from the industrial lot, unhurried even now, even with a flashlight on it, turning his head slowly toward the officer at his window with the mild, patient expression of a man being asked for directions. He did not reach for anything. He did not run. Running is for people who believe there is somewhere the story doesn't reach them, and he had never once believed that. It was the whole of his craft to be a man who was already, always, prepared to be found and to give them nothing when he was. They brought him out standing, and he came without a word, and as they walked him past the mouth of my street, he looked once, across all that dark, directly at me where I stood on my own frozen lawn, not with hatred, not with fear, with something worse than both, the thing I had traded him my face for on a dark industrial street a lifetime ago. Recognition. He knew exactly who I was. He had known, I understood, in that half-second, longer than I had known him. He had sat outside this house 3 autumns ago and learned my patterns while I congratulated myself on choosing my husband. And now he looked at me across my own lawn with the flat, calm nod of one professional acknowledging another at the end of a long job, a nod that said, without a muscle moving in that forgettable face, "You were better than I told him you were," and then he turned his head away and got into the car and was gone. I have seen that nod in my sleep, more nights than I will admit. It is the only time in the whole 3 years that another human being looked at the real me, not Claire, not the grieving wife, not the instrument, and saw all the way to the bottom and was not afraid, and I am not certain, even now, that I was the one who won that look. He said even less than David did. His kind always does. Saying nothing is the whole of his craft, but the cloned phone said everything he never would. And the quiet man who had helped drown Diane, who had photographed me on a playground bench and scheduled my death for a Saturday, was finally, for the first time in years, somewhere he could not simply walk away from. Chloe slept through all of it, which is the one mercy of that night I am purely grateful for, and Renata stood in my driveway with her arms wrapped around herself and watched the man she had known as Michael fold down into the back of the sedan, and when the taillights were gone she turned to me with a week's worth of terror finally shaking loose all over her honest face. And she said, "We did it, Claire. We did it." And she reached for me, one survivor to another, and I held her, and I meant it, and that is when I understood the last thing, the thing none of my 3 cold years had prepared me for. I could have let it end there. David going down for Diane meant David going down forever. The recording was a noose. The file was a map. Renata and Matteo were safe, and I could have walked out of that driveway as Claire, the brave wife who helped, my invented aunt and my forged inheritance, and my 3 years of premeditation buried for good under a hero's story that Renata herself would tell the world. All I had to do was keep the last lie, keep letting the one genuinely good person the whole nightmare had put in my hands believe that she and I were the same kind of thing. And I found, standing there with her arms around me and a killer's taillights not yet cold, that I could destroy the man who murdered my sister, or I could keep lying to Renata, but I no longer had the coldness to do both. 3 years of it had grown that organ inside me, and 1 week of a decent woman's friendship had, without my permission, begun to dissolve it. So I told her. In the driveway, in the dark, I told Renata everything, the way I have now told you. Diane, the forged aunt, the keys to her cream-walled house, the 2 photographs I took myself, that I chose her off a list, that I lit the fuse under her life on purpose, that her genuine terror had been, at the start, a tool in my hand. I gave her the truth as a gift and a wound at once, because she had earned the first and I owed her the second. And then I stood in my own driveway and let a woman I had used decide what to do with a confession that could still unmake me completely. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I heard the whole sleeping neighborhood, a dog somewhere, the tick of the cooling engine, my own blood in my ears. Then Renata said, "Diane was lucky to have you." And she said it with tears standing in her eyes and her jaw set in a way I would come to know very well. "And you are never going to do anything like this again. Not because you'd get caught. You're clearly too good to get caught, and that's exactly the problem. Because I am going to be standing next to you for the rest of your life, making sure the coldest thing you ever have to be again is a good friend at a bad funeral." I have thought a great deal since about who was playing whom. David spent 11 years certain he was playing 2 wives, and he was, right up until one of them turned out to be a hunter who had spent 3 years playing him. And I spent 3 years certain I was playing everyone, David and Renata, and a tired detective, and the shrugging law, and the memory of a woman I loved, right up until the real wife, the honest one, the instrument I had chosen precisely because she was too genuine to lie, looked at the entire cold machine I had built out of my grief, and instead of running from me or turning me in, simply refused to let me be alone inside it. Which is a move, too, the oldest one there is, the one Diane would have made, and did make, for me, 100 times, across a thin wall at 3 in the morning for 20 years. We buried Diane properly, the 2 of us, months later, at a grave in a small, quiet county that almost no one had ever visited. Mateo came. Chloe came. A brother and a sister meeting for the first time, over the headstone of the woman who had connected them without ever knowing they would exist. And David is where the law, in the end, agreed to keep him. For Diane, on the strength of his own warm, smiling voice over the sound of running water. People think a con is about being the smartest one in the room. It isn't. I was the smartest one in every room for 3 years, and it very nearly cost me the only thing that turned out to be worth having, which is one single person who knows exactly what you are, all the way down, and stays anyway. The real trick, the one Diane knew, and I had forgotten, and Renata taught me back in a driveway with a murderer's taillights, fading down the street, is knowing the moment to stop playing, to lay your actual hand face up on the table, and to find out when you finally do that the person across from you was never your mark at all. She was your witness. She was always, from the very first cold word of it, going to be your witness. The only question, the whole long time, was to what? Epilogue. A year later it was October again, the month Diane died and the month I married her killer, and I have made my peace with the fact that the worst month of my calendar is also, now, the one where I feel her closest. Renata and Mateo came for the weekend, the way they do one weekend a month, the 2 families that a monster built becoming slowly, on purpose, one real one. Chloe and Mateo argued about a board game in the next room in the particular key of siblings, which is what they are, which is the one clean thing to come out of all of it. Ellen. I keep track of Ellen, quietly, from a distance, the way I keep track of weather. She moved to be near her son across the ocean 6 months after a certain charming man was arrested an hour and a half from her town and simply, from her point of view, stopped calling. She never knew. That is the only kind of saving I have ever been any good at, and I have stopped being ashamed of it. We were doing the dishes, Renata and I, the 2 of us at my sink in the gray kitchen that is not frightening anymore. when my phone lit up on the counter. A number I did not know. A little gray bubble. And I felt it before I read it, the old cold coming up my arms, because I have felt exactly this once before, in a school pickup line, with my daughter waving at me from a curb. Renata saw my face and turned the water off, and we stood there, two women who know precisely what a photograph of a sleeping stranger means, and we looked at the little gray bubble together. It was 4 words long. "Are you Claire?" it said. And then, before I could breathe, the second one came, the way the second one always comes, and it had a photograph attached, a man I had never seen, asleep, on his back, one arm flung up over his head, his mouth fallen open in a room with cream walls and a window on the wrong side of the headboard, and underneath it 5 words, from a woman somewhere out there in the dark who had gone looking and found, instead of a detective, instead of the shrugging law, a name that another frightened wife had whispered to her across a kitchen table. "They told me to find you." I looked at Renata. Renata looked at me, and she did not go pale, and she did not reach for the counter to steady herself. She dried her hands on the dish towel, slowly, and she set her jaw in the way I have come to know very well, the way that means she has decided something, and she said, "Well, just that." And then she said, "Text her back. Tell her she's not the only one. Tell her we're coming." Because that is the thing about becoming a witness. Once you have been one all the way to the bottom, you cannot go back to being only a wife at a sink. Someone, somewhere, is always in a car in a pickup line, with the floor about to drop out of her life. And now, at least, there is a number she can call. I picked up my phone, and I began for the second time in my life to type the truest 4 words I know. "You don't know me." The end.